It was around midnight when I got the text. My friend had found a Ouija board buried in an old thrift store and, of course, thought it was perfect for some late-night thrills. I hadn't exactly signed up for a brush with the supernatural that night, but something compelled me to say yes. When I arrived, the house was shrouded in darkness, save for a dim lamp in the corner casting long shadows across the room. The others were already seated around the board, waiting with an intensity that felt a little too heavy for just a game. "Let's start," someone whispered, and I couldn't tell who. The words hung in the air, and then everything went quiet. The silence didn't feel normal, though. Felt expectant. We each placed a finger on the planchette. It was ice cold, like it had been sitting in a freezer. I glanced around the circle, and everyone seemed unnerved, but no one dared back out. The question dropped, almost daring us all. "Is anyone here with us?" The planchette trembled, then slid to yes. At first, we thought one of us had moved it, but as our fingers hovered, barely touching, it moved again, more insistently. It spelled out, IWATCH. A chill ran down my spine. I laughed nervously, but no one else even breathed. I wanted to pull my hand away, but I couldn't. It was like the planchette had some kind of hold on us. Another question popped out. Unplanned, unfiltered. "Who are you?" The planchette stilled for a second, then slid to spell FACELESS. We stared, transfixed, our fingers glued to the planchette. A crash sounded from the other room, and we all jumped. Someone laughed, uneasy, muttering about the wind, but we knew better. The air felt charged, like there was something else in the room with us, watching, waiting. I felt it behind me first, a cold breath against my neck. Slowly, I turned, expecting to see someone standing there. Nothing, but the chill deepened, seeping into my bones. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up, and my heart hammered so loud, I was sure everyone could hear it. Someone whispered, maybe we should stop, but the planchette didn't stop. It dragged our fingers across the board, faster now, spelling out words we couldn't keep up with, words that seemed to blend into each other. My mind barely registered the phrases. Don't look. It's coming. Close the door. The words blurred as the planchette moved with violent jerks. And then, it stopped on GO. We sat frozen, looking around, not sure if we should leave or if it was a trick. That's when the air thickened, a low hum buzzing through the walls, like something was reverberating from the other side. The lights flickered, dimmed to nothing. Then, in the darkness, I saw it. A shadow standing by the doorway, still as stone, featureless and silent. It seemed to watch us, its presence dense and oppressive, more a void than a figure. No face, no features, just a pitch-black outline that soaked up every ounce of light left in the room. We stared, wide-eyed and trapped in its gaze. And then it moved. It stepped closer, the air growing colder with every footfall, even though it didn't make a sound. My heart raced. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The shadow drew closer, hovering just at the edge of the light, reaching out a hand that seemed to dissolve and reform in the darkness. Someone bolted out of the circle, knocking over a candle, breaking the stillness. In an instant, the shadow vanished, and the lights snapped back on, revealing nothing but the overturned board and a scattering of charred candle wax. We fled that night, leaving the board behind. But since then, I've felt it, watching, waiting, just at the edges of my vision. I don't dare touch a Ouija board again. After that night, I tried to shake it off. I told myself it was all nerves, that maybe one of my friends had pulled a prank. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. It was like a part of me hadn't left that room. It stayed there, trapped with whatever we'd summoned. The first time I saw the shadow again was a week later. I'd just gotten home after a long shift. My apartment was small, barely more than a shoebox with a bed. But it was cozy, safe, or so I thought. I was brushing my teeth, looking into the bathroom mirror, half asleep and ready to crash. That's when I felt it. This prickling at the back of my neck, a familiar, icy presence. I glanced up and for a split second, I saw it in the reflection. Just a shadow at first, hovering by the doorway, featureless and still. I froze, staring at it, hoping it was just a trick of the light. Then, it started to move, slowly gliding toward me, stretching long and thin as it neared the doorway. My blood ran cold. I tried to convince myself it was just fatigue, that I was seeing things in the half-light. But then it did something that shattered that illusion. It raised a hand and pointed directly at me. I backed away, my heart pounding, but as I blinked, it was gone. Just an empty doorway behind me, the lights a little too bright. I felt sick, but I tried to shake it off, blaming it on lack of sleep. I forced myself to go to bed that night, keeping the lights on, the blankets pulled up to my chin. The next day, my friends didn't seem surprised when I told them about it. In fact, they'd each had their own encounters since that night, strange and disturbing in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. One had found strange handprints on her window, too high up for anyone to reach without a ladder. Another swore he kept hearing whispers in his apartment, soft murmurs that stopped the moment he tried to listen closely. But it was the last friend's experience that shook me the most. She'd been asleep, or so she thought, when she felt a crushing weight on her chest. Her eyes fluttered open, and she saw the shadow perched over her, inches from her face, its hand resting heavily on her chest. She couldn't move, couldn't scream. She said it was like it was breathing her in, like every second she lay there, it drained something vital from her. By now, it was clear this thing hadn't stayed in the house. It had followed us, each of us carrying a piece of it. And whatever it wasn't done with us. I started losing sleep, dreading the nights when I'd feel its presence again. Every time I drifted off, I'd wake up to find it lurking just out of sight. Sometimes in the corner, sometimes by the door. Sometimes, I'd feel its breath, cold and sharp, brushing against my face. I'd snap my eyes open, but it was always gone before I could fully see it. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I wanted answers. Desperation drove me back to that house where we'd used the board. I dragged one of my friends along, hoping that confronting it would break whatever hold it had on us. We found the Ouija board right where we'd left it, gathering dust in the corner. With shaking hands, we set it up again, placing our fingers lightly on the planchette. I could barely speak, but I managed to choke out, "What do you want from us?" The planchette stayed still, and for a moment I thought we'd finally broken free, that it had left us. But then, almost painfully slow, it slid across the board to spell a single word, "Stay." I felt an overwhelming dread, a weight pressing down on my chest. But I pushed on, needing to know. "Why?" I whispered. The planchette moved again, spelling out a phrase that made my skin crawl. "Tobecome." My friend and I exchanged panicked glances, both of us realizing the truth at the same time. It wanted us to become like it, to replace whatever it had been before, to trap us in that same darkness. I wanted to leave, to burn the board, to pretend none of this had ever happened. But as I pulled my fingers away, the planchette yanked back under my hand, as if it had a mind of its own. It spelled one last message, one I can still feel echoing in my mind every time I close my eyes. "Youarealmostmine." The lights flickered, and the air grew thick, pressing in around us. I felt it, reaching out, trying to pull me in, to take me. In one last act of defiance, I threw the board across the room, breaking whatever spell had bound us there. We fled, not daring to look back, but I knew it wasn't over, because even now, I still see it sometimes. Just at the edges of my vision, watching, waiting, its shadow stretching closer every night. After that night, I was never truly alone. Even in a crowded room, there was this feeling, this constant presence pressing down on me, like something unseen hovering just behind my shoulder. I kept telling myself it was paranoia, that I'd let this whole thing get to my head. But then the incidents started happening again, creeping into my life like slow poison. It was subtle at first. Shadows didn't just stretch with the light. They seemed to linger, darkening spaces where no shadow should be. I'd catch glimpses in reflective surfaces. A black shape hovering behind me, just for a second. Once, while washing dishes, I looked up at the kitchen window and saw it standing in the yard, perfectly still, just watching me. My heart pounded as I spun around, but when I looked again, the yard was empty. Yet, every time I was left with this bone-deep certainty that it had been there. Things got worse from there. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling something heavy pressed down on my chest, a weight that left me gasping for air. I'd sit up, drenched in sweat, only to see the familiar shadow at the edge of my bed, darker than anything in the room. His form seemed to shift, like smoke trying to solidify. I couldn't see a face, but I could feel it watching me, could almost hear it breathing. Each encounter left me more drained, like it was sapping something essential from me. The circles under my eyes deepened, and my skin grew pale. Friends started noticing, asking if I was okay, but how could I tell them? How could I explain that a thing, an emptiness, was haunting me, slowly consuming pieces of me? One night, after waking up to that suffocating pressure again, I knew I couldn't handle it alone anymore. I reached out to one of my friends from the Ouija session, someone I knew was also still haunted by the entity. She agreed to come over, both of us desperate for some kind of solution. She showed up looking as bad as I felt, her eyes haunted and tired, like she hadn't slept in days. "I can still feel it," she said as soon as she stepped inside. Her voice trembled. "It's like it's getting closer." We decided to try one last thing. Desperation drove us to it. I pulled up a ritual I'd read about online, a way to banish dark spirits. Felt like a long shot, but we were out of options. We gathered candles, salt, and sage, following every instruction to the letter. When everything was set, we lit the candles and started chanting the words we'd written down. The room felt different almost immediately, the air growing colder, heavy with something ancient and hostile. The shadows around us deepened, thickening like tar, pressing in from all sides. My friend gripped my hand tightly, her fingers trembling. Just as we reached the final line of the chant, every candle snuffed out, plunging us into darkness. I froze, my breath shallow, heart racing in my chest. For a long moment, there was only silence, thick and suffocating. Then we heard it, a low, rumbling whisper that seemed to come from every corner of the room. "Youbelongtome." The voice was hollow, echoing, as though it were coming from somewhere far, far away, yet it resonated inside my head, reverberating against my skull. My friend let out a strangled sob, gripping my hand harder as we both trembled. The shadows moved then, converging into a single point in the middle of the room. Slowly, they rose, shaping themselves into a form, tall, thin, and blacker than any darkness I'd ever seen. It towered over us, stretching upward, its face an empty void, yet I could feel its gaze burning into me. In a last, desperate act, I grabbed the sage and tried to light it again, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage it. But the flame finally took, sparking to life in the dark. The shadows recoiled, shrinking back, and the figure hissed, a sound like nails scraping over glass. It shrank, slowly dissolving into the darkness, fading until all that remained was silence and the acrid smell of smoke. When the lights came back on, the room was empty. The weight in the air lifted, but I still felt it, lingering just out of reach. My friend and I sat there in silence for a long time, shaken to our core, knowing that while the ritual may have driven it away for now, it wasn't gone. It was only waiting, biding its time. We don't talk about that night, my friends and I. The shadows have stopped following me as closely, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel a cold breath at the back of my neck, or see a dark form at the edge of my vision, just watching, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down, because I know it's still there, and one day, it will come back for me. Weeks passed, and life slowly returned to a fragile version of normal. I stopped seeing the shadow lurking in every corner, and the whispers that haunted my nights faded to a distant memory. My friends and I didn't talk about the board or the night of the ritual. It was an unspoken pact to pretend none of it had ever happened. But deep down, we all knew the truth, that we'd only bought ourselves time. Then one night, I woke with a start, heart pounding, and the room plunged into an unnatural silence. My clock had stopped, its red numbers frozen at 3:33 a.m. There was a stillness in the air, thick and heavy, as if something was smothering every sound. I felt it, then the cold, familiar pressure against my chest, pinning me down, robbing me of breath. Couldn't move, couldn't scream. My eyes darted around the room, and that's when I saw it, hovering at the foot of my bed, its void-like form stretching from floor to ceiling. It was back. Only this time it wasn't content to just watch. The figure leaned forward, filling my vision, a churning darkness that seemed to swallow the room. I felt its cold, inhuman gaze fixed on me, and then, in a voice like dead leaves scraping over stone, it spoke. "I warned you," it rasped. "You are almost mine." I tried to struggle, to pull away, but it was as though I was sinking deeper and deeper into the mattress, my body locked in place. And then, it touched me. The feeling was beyond cold, beyond fear. A creeping emptiness seeping into my skin, pulling me towards some abyss I couldn't see but could feel. It wanted to pull me under, to take me beyond the veil. Desperate, I forced a single word through my lips, a feeble, strangled whisper. "No." The darkness stilled, its shape shifting and roiling, as if it were considering me. I felt a flicker of defiance, a surge of strength, and in that moment, I remembered the final words from the ritual, words I hadn't dared to speak because I was too terrified of what they might summon. But now, with nothing left to lose, I forced the words out, barely audible, but there, filling the room. "I reject you. You have no claim here. Begone." For a heartbeat, everything went still. Then the shadow let out a scream, a sound so unnatural it made my skin crawl and my blood feel like ice in my veins. It was a scream of rage, of frustration, like something denied a feast. The figure convulsed, splitting and shattering as light began to creep into the room, pushing the darkness back. I felt its hold on me weaken, and I sat up, gasping, the weight lifting from my chest as the first rays of dawn pierced through the window. The shadow shrank, recoiling, until it was no more than a sliver in the farthest corner, its empty gaze filled with a hatred that I could feel in my bones. With one last, lingering look, it faded, retreating into whatever dark void it had come from. The silence that followed was almost deafening, but it was a silence filled with peace, not dread. I knew somehow that it was over. Whatever bond I'd accidentally formed with that thing had been broken. I was free. I haven't seen it since that night, though sometimes, in quiet moments, I think I catch a hint of that icy presence, like it's waiting just beyond the veil. Maybe it's only a memory, or maybe it's a reminder, a warning that there are things we should never meddle with. But every time I start to doubt, I remember that voice, those words echoing in my mind, and I remind myself to never, ever let my guard down, because some doors, once opened, can never be fully closed. I don't know why I agreed to it in the first place. Maybe it was the few drinks we'd had, or maybe it was the way the Ouija board sat there on the table, practically daring us. You know, like it was watching us, waiting for one of us to crack. The house had been quiet all night, just the three of us in the dim glow of some candles we'd lit for atmosphere. I didn't expect anything to happen, not really, but there was this weird tension that crept in as soon as the board was out. It started simply enough. Fingers on the planchette, everyone in the circle looking at each other like, what's the worst that could happen? I'll tell you, though, the worst came a whole lot faster than we expected. I asked the first question just to break the silence. Is anyone here with us? Nothing happened. No movement, no strange sounds, nothing. We all relaxed, laughed it off, and one of my friends dared me to ask again, louder. So I did. This time, a shiver ran through me. The planchette moved. I was sure one of them had done it, just trying to freak me out. I shot them both a look, but they seemed just as surprised as I was. I wasn't about to show them I was freaked out, so I pressed on. What's your name? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. The planchette shifted, slowly sliding from one letter to the next. L. We all sat there, dead silent, watching the board like it had come to life. I felt this pressure in the room, like something was pushing down on us, and suddenly, the candles dimmed, flickering as if caught in some invisible draft. "Alan?" I whispered, suddenly feeling like I'd made a huge mistake. The board didn't respond right away. The planchette just sat there like it was considering me, watching. And then, it moved again, spelling out, "Get out." One of my friends laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but we all felt it. The room had gone icy cold. It wasn't like someone had just turned down the thermostat. It was the kind of cold that cuts through you, the kind that feels alive. But we didn't leave. I wish we had. Instead, I asked why. The board jerked. Not slowly, not playfully, but violently, almost ripping out from under our fingers. This time it spelled out one word: danger. We pulled our hands back, looking around the room, half expecting something to leap out of the shadows. But the only sound was the low hum of the candles flickering. I reached for the planchette again, almost as if something was guiding me, making me do it. Against my better judgment, I asked one last question. "What do you want?" The planchette moved, faster than before, spelling out two words that have haunted me every night since: "Your soul." Before any of us could react, one of the candles tipped over, spilling hot wax onto the table. The flame went out, plunging us into near darkness. In the candlelight, I could have sworn I saw a shadow moving, no, not moving, looming, growing, right there in the room with us. I felt its gaze on me, a cold, piercing sensation that went straight to my core. And then, from somewhere in the house, there was a low, guttural laugh, one that sent a shiver down my spine and made my skin crawl. None of us dared move, but it didn't stop there. Just as that laugh echoed through the room, we heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. They were coming from upstairs, each step slow and echoing, as if whoever or whatever was up there wanted us to know it was coming. We all froze, holding our breath, straining to hear. It sounded like it was dragging something across the floor, a rough, scraping sound that made my stomach twist. My friend grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to hurt, and he whispered, "Dude, we need to get out of here. Now." But I couldn't move. I felt like I was rooted to the spot, as if some unseen force was holding me down, refusing to let me go. The footsteps got louder, closer, and then they stopped right above us. Whatever was up there, it was directly overhead. The silence that followed was worse. It was this charged, electric quiet, like the air before a thunderstorm. I felt something shift in the room, a subtle weight pressing down, suffocating. And then I noticed the smell. It was sickly sweet, like rotting flowers, mixed with something else, something metallic and sharp. Blood. The scent filled my lungs, making me gag, and I had this overwhelming sense of dread, like whatever was up there wasn't just waiting. It was hungry. Against every instinct, I forced myself to speak, my voice barely a whisper. "Who are you?" I regretted it the instant the words left my mouth. The Ouija board reacted immediately. The planchette slammed across the board, faster and harder than before, spelling out letters in a furious blur that I barely managed to follow. W. L. I glanced at my friends, the horror mirrored on their faces. Alan? It had spelled that name before. Was that who, or what was upstairs? I didn't get a chance to ask, because as soon as I looked back down, the board moved again, spelling out something new, something that made my blood run cold. K. L. L. E. D. We were all holding our breath, trying to process what it was saying. "Killed?" my friend whispered, his voice shaking. "Killed who?" And then, like it was answering him, the board started to spell out more. This time, it spelled 3 words, slow and deliberate, almost as if savoring each one. Y-O-U-E-T. The last candle went out, plunging us into total darkness. In the pitch black, panic took over. We scrambled to find our phones, anything that could give us light, but our hands were shaking so badly that we couldn't even unlock the screens. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might explode. I whispered into the darkness, desperate and shaky, "Who's there?" What do you want from us? From somewhere in the blackness, that same low laugh echoed. But this time it was closer, right behind me. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, and I turned around slowly, feeling my pulse hammering in my throat. My eyes strained to adjust, and just as I was beginning to make out shapes in the room, I saw it. A shadow, darker than the room itself, stood just beyond the table. It had no face, no features, just this massive, hulking presence, a human shape that seemed to swallow any light around it. And it was leaning in, almost curiously, as if it was studying us. "Get out," it was a voice, low and guttural. A single command whispered into the room. My friends and I backed away instinctively, but the board hadn't finished with us yet. The planchette moved on its own again, even though none of us were touching it. It spelled out one final message, slowly, as if mocking us. I swallowed, my throat dry, and my voice barely a croak. "Stay? What does it want us to?" Suddenly, one of my friends let out a blood-curdling scream. His face was frozen in horror, and he was staring at something none of us could see. He pointed to a spot above the board, his finger trembling. It's in the board," he whispered, almost too softly to hear. "It's trapped in the board, and it wants out." The realization hit us all at once. This wasn't just some ghostly presence. This was something that had been bound to the Ouija board, waiting for someone to come along and set it free. And we were the unlucky ones who'd disturbed it. My other friend grabbed my arm, his grip so tight it hurt. "We have to close it. We have to say goodbye," he shouted, his voice filled with terror. But before any of us could move, the planchette darted across the board, spelling out one last word, each letter sharp and unrelenting. A blast of icy air hit us, like a gust from an open freezer, and I felt it move through me, leaving this burning electric chill in my chest. It was like my lungs were frozen. My friends were screaming, but I couldn't make a sound. I was paralyzed, unable to move, unable to breathe, as if something was pulling me under. And then, just as quickly as it had come, the shadow vanished. The room was silent, the candles flickering back to life as if nothing had happened. But the board was cracked down the middle, the planchette resting on the word yes. We bolted out of that house, leaving the board shattered on the table. We didn't talk, didn't look back, just ran until our lungs burned. I don't know what it was, what kind of entity we'd stirred up, but I can still feel it sometimes, late at night. The icy chill creeping up my spine, the shadow lurking just out of sight, and that voice, echoing in my mind, whispering over and over, "You'll never escape me." Weeks passed, but that night clung to me like a shadow. I started having nightmares, visions of that dark figure, watching from the corners of my room, standing just beyond the reach of light. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart racing, and I could swear I felt its icy breath on my skin. My friends weren't doing any better. One of them moved out of state without a word, and the other stopped answering my calls altogether. We were all trying to escape, but deep down, I knew there was no running from this. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know if it was all in my head, or if that thing had actually followed me. So, against every ounce of common sense I had, I decided to return to that house, alone. I thought if I could just close the board properly, say goodbye, maybe I could put an end to it. The house was eerily quiet when I got there, the kind of silence that feels heavy, pressing down on you. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up as I walked through the front door. Everything was exactly as we'd left it. The candles burned down to stubs, the shattered Ouija board, still lying on the table, split right down the middle. The air was stale, thick, like something was lurking just beneath the surface, waiting. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and placed my hands on the broken planchette. "Goodbye," I whispered, my voice trembling. "I'm saying goodbye." First, nothing happened. But then, the room began to grow colder, the temperature dropping with each passing second. My breath fogged up in front of me, and I could feel the weight of something pressing down on my shoulders, something watching. And then, I heard it, the same voice from that night. "You can't leave. It hissed, filling the room with a menacing echo that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I yanked my hands back, but it was too late. The broken planchette started moving on its own, scraping across the board with a sickening, splintering sound. It spelled out one final message, slowly, deliberately. "I'm already here." I backed away, heart pounding, but I could feel it closing in. That dark presence, creeping around me like a fog, cold fingers brushing against my skin. I stumbled toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the whole house had turned against me, trapping me inside. The darkness began to thicken, twisting and curling into a form that blocked the doorway. It was that same shadow, towering over me, its face a void, its eyes like endless pits. I could feel it pulling me in, the chill creeping through my veins, my limbs growing heavy. I wanted to scream, but the sound died in my throat, and then a single thought pierced through the terror. Run. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to move, charging through the shadow. I felt it clutch at me, cold fingers grazing my skin, but I pushed forward, bursting through the door and out into the night. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, collapsing onto the sidewalk, gasping for breath. I never went back to that house. In fact, I avoid that entire street now. But I know it's not over. I can feel it, lurking just at the edge of my vision, in the corners of dark rooms, in the cold drafts that brush past me when I'm alone. It left that house with me. Every night, as I drift off to sleep, I hear that voice whispering, low and cold, like a promise that it'll never let me go. I'm already here. It all started when I agreed to join a Ouija board session just for the laughs, or so I thought. A friend brought it up on one of those Friday nights, the kind that feels like nothing can go wrong. But the air felt odd the moment we sat around the board. I chalked it up to nerves, but I was already on edge. We dimmed the lights and gathered around the board. The wooden planchette was smooth, polished from years of use, a family heirloom, or so they said. After lighting candles and drawing the shades, the room had a quiet that seemed to swallow every sound. The first few minutes, nothing happened. We were all chuckling, letting out nervous sighs. Someone even made a joke. Guess the spirits are asleep. But then it started moving. The planchette glided across the board, but nobody seemed to be pushing it. Spelled out, "Hello." We all exchanged nervous glances, half laughing, half hoping someone would admit they were messing with us. But we were silent. I remember swallowing hard and feeling my palms grow clammy. I looked around, and everyone else was watching it, spellbound. One of us asked, "Who are we speaking to?" The planchette moved faster this time, spelling out a name I didn't recognize. I kept waiting for someone to laugh, to tell us it was a joke. But no one did. We continued asking more questions, testing the spirit. Every answer seemed vague, mysterious, yet chilling in its certainty. Then it spelled out my name. I felt my stomach drop. My heart pounded against my ribs like it was trying to escape. My friends just stared, unsure what to say. Then the board spelled out something else. "I'm coming." I was done. I stood up, pushing my chair back, but everyone else seemed glued to their spots. "Let's end this," I said, my voice shaking. But the board had other plans. The planchette spelled, "No." The candles flickered, casting shadows that seemed to stretch and pulse. I took a step back, feeling like something was watching, just beyond the edge of the candlelight. And then, for the briefest second, I thought I saw something. A face, shadowed and twisted, staring at me from the corner of the room. The chill that ran through me was bone deep. I froze, my eyes fixed on the shadowed corner where I thought I'd seen the face. It was there, but gone in an instant, like a trick of the light, or at least that's what I tried to tell myself. My friends were still around the Ouija board, oblivious, still asking questions. I wanted to scream at them to stop, but my throat felt tight, like something was pressing on it. One of my friends, the one who had suggested the whole thing, leaned in, seemingly unfazed. "Who are you coming for?" she asked, barely above a whisper. The planchette slid across the board again, spelling out my name. That was it. I backed up, muttering some excuse about feeling sick, but my voice didn't even sound like my own. They looked up, puzzled, but I could see the same fear mirrored in their eyes. I wasn't the only one scared out of my mind, but no one dared to break the circle. The planchette moved on its own again, jerking side to side as if it was agitated. Spelled, "Don't leave." My friend reached out, grabbing my wrist, and pulled me back toward the board. "You can't leave without saying goodbye. You have to end it or..." Her words trailed off as the planchette began moving in figure eights, looping faster and faster. My head started pounding, each thud of my heart synchronized with the movement of the planchette. I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The air felt thick, pressing down on me from all sides. Then, it spelled out one last word. "Run." I didn't need another warning. I bolted for the door, and the others followed, spilling into the hallway in a panic. As I reached the door, I felt a sudden, icy gust of wind from behind me, like something had brushed past. My skin crawled, and I dared one last look over my shoulder. The room was empty, just as we had left it, with the Ouija board still on the floor. But the planchette, it was moving on its own. We stood in the hallway, trying to catch our breath, each of us staring back at the room like it might reach out and grab us. We were all panting, trying to process what had just happened. My friend, the one who had been so eager to play, whispered, "We didn't close it. We didn't say goodbye." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I'd ever experienced. None of us wanted to go back into that room, but I could feel that presence, like it was in the walls, lurking in every shadow, waiting for one of us to slip up. Finally, we mustered the courage to go back. The candles had burned lower, casting strange shapes across the walls. And the planchette, it had moved again. This time, it rested over the word "hello" on the board. One of my friends reached down to touch it, but I pulled his hand back. "Don't," I hissed. My voice shook. "We'll just say goodbye and get out. That's it." We all gathered around the board again, our fingers hovering, not quite touching the planchette. I was terrified it would start moving on its own again. My heart was hammering so loudly I thought it might drown out everything else. As we whispered goodbye, something creaked in the room. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the corner where I had seen that shadowed face. None of us dared look, but I could feel it, like a weight bearing down on my shoulders. I was gripping the edge of the board so hard my knuckles had gone white. Then, without warning, the planchette jerked to the word "no." I gasped, snatching my hand away. The room seemed to grow colder, and I could swear I felt something brush against my arm, like fingers grazing my skin. My friends jumped back, one of them almost tripping over their chair. The candles flickered violently, casting monstrous, twisting shadows across the walls. My friend's voice was barely a whisper. "It doesn't want us to leave." We stood frozen, helpless. The planchette started to slide again, spelling out one word, over and over. Mine couldn't breathe. We stumbled back out of the room, slamming the door shut behind us. As we fled down the hallway, I thought I heard something scrape against the inside of the door, like nails scratching, desperate to get out. For the next few days, I tried to shake it off, to convince myself it was just nerves, just a bad experience. But that night, as I lay in bed, I started hearing whispers. That first night, I barely slept. The whispers came and went, too faint to make out, like voices caught on a distant breeze. They floated around me, growing louder whenever I closed my eyes, vanishing the moment I snapped them open. I tried to tell myself it was just paranoia, an echo of that night, but deep down, I knew something had followed me. The second night, it got worse. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud thud in my room. My eyes shot open, and there, in the corner, was the shape of a figure. Dark, hunched, barely visible in the dim light. I blinked, hoping it was just a shadow, but it stayed, shifting slightly, as though it were breathing. I wanted to scream, but fear locked my throat. Slowly, as if sensing my horror, it began to move. I saw fingers, unnaturally long and thin, pressing against the floor, dragging its body toward me, inch by agonizing inch. A twisted face emerged from the darkness, hollow eyes fixed on me. Its mouth stretched wide in a grotesque, silent scream. Couldn't look away. Couldn't even move. All I could do was lie there as it crawled closer, each movement slow and deliberate, like it was savoring my fear. Just as it reached the edge of my bed, it stopped. It tilted its head, that empty gaze burning into mine. And then, in a low, raspy voice, it whispered mine. My body finally unlocked, and I screamed. I shot up, reaching for the light, my hands shaking so hard I nearly knocked the lamp off the table. As the light filled the room, the figure vanished, leaving nothing behind but the lingering chill and my racing heartbeat. The next day, I went back to the friend who owned the Ouija board. I demanded answers, begged them to tell me how to make it stop. They looked just as frightened as I felt, admitting they'd been hearing things too, seeing shadows in their home. None of us knew what to do. Desperate, we researched how to close a Ouija session properly, reading every bit of advice and ritual we could find. That night, we gathered again, each of us armed with salt, candles, and prayers from every religion we could think of. We placed the board in the center of the room, and, with trembling hands, we set our fingers on the planchette. Together, we whispered, "Goodbye." For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. And then, just as we were about to pull our hands away, the planchette moved, slowly, reluctantly, like something was fighting against it. It spelled out one final message. "See you soon." My heart sank, and a cold dread settled in my chest as we watched the planchette glide over to goodbye. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. And then, one by one, they snuffed out, plunging us into darkness. Since that night, the whispers have stopped, and I haven't seen the shadow again. But every so often, late at night, I feel a presence just outside my bedroom door, waiting, watching. I know it's not over. Whatever we let in that night is still out there, waiting for the moment I slip up, the moment I let my guard down. And sometimes, just sometimes, when the night is quiet, I swear I can hear it, faint and far away, whispering my name.